over again. The question is, can you wait? Can you kind of sit around and keep operating the way you are? I love this quote by Ernest Hemingway, right? And I like to say companies go through 3 stages: risk-taking, caretaking, and undertaking. And when you think about it, every company in this room at some point in their life was a startup where somebody took a risk to go start that company. And sometimes we forget that it's still way back in our DNA, that we were once a little company that had to go create a category or build a new platform. And we need to make sure that we honor that and basically preserve the ability to exist 5 to 10 years from now by doing things that may feel uncomfortable, that create the next generation version of ourselves. And we call that running at 2 speeds. Running at 2 speeds is important because no matter how much on top you are, eventually you can fall. Right? We've all seen this chart. It's pretty sobering, right? So the best companies in every industry fall out every 3 to 5 years. Right? They might get acquired, they might go out of business, they might get merged, but they don't survive the way they are. So I think this is kind of a warning sign to say it doesn't matter the industry, you've got to start laying the plans now for that second speed, the one that allows you to experiment, take some big swings while you're running your current business. And that's really what Goliath's Revenge is all about. Because we believe that once again, you guys are sitting on a lot of these advantages. It turns out that 60% of the data in the world is proprietary. It's controlled by companies like you, not controlled by Facebook and WeChat. It's actually sitting in many cases locked away in the data vaults of companies. Unfortunately, most of it not very usable. And so how do we put that to work? How do we put our brand reach to work and the trust we've built with our customers? Most startups would salivate to have brand equity like your companies, right? How do we put our institutional knowledge of how the industry works and how to manage regulators and standards? Those are hugely important. And once again, if you're a startup, you don't have a seat at that table. So these are all assets we're blessed with as legacy and incumbent providers that we need to take advantage of to become disruptors. I love telling this story because pizza is not only something I like, but it's a very traditional business, right? So pizza delivery, and in this case, Domino's was kind of on the map. Their stock price was just above, really, almost above the death mark of $8 back in 2010 when a guy named Patrick Doyle took over. He decided 2 things. We need to fix the product. Our pizza sucks. Nobody likes it. So that was one piece of it. But the other thing is we're going to use technology to deliver a better experience than anybody on the planet. And what's interesting is that was a 6 to 7 year journey. So that's another key message I want to leave you guys. This is not a overnight wave of wand, you become a digital new normal company, right? This is a courageous commitment with your board, with your employees, to bring them along to be able to run at these 2 speeds. If you look at where they are now, their stock outperformed Google, Netflix, Apple over a 7-year period. Why? Because they did what they said, right? They took technology and they delivered a better experience, and their business is so much more efficient than anybody else in their space. In fact, they're developing their own transportation car now, called the DXP. It basically holds 80 pizzas in a warming oven. It uses sensors to make sure the pizza's at the right temperature when it gets delivered to the customer, and the customer can order through any touch point they want. If you go to Domino's headquarters in Ann Arbor, there's 800 people in that building. 400 of them are data scientists and developers. So a pizza company where half the employees in their corporate headquarters are technologists. So this story is kind of repeating itself over and over again. And once again, I'll talk about the rules in the book. These are just guidelines to say, hey, you know what? All hope is not lost if you're an established company. You can be a disruptor. You can pull off what Domino's did. And I'm going to talk about each of these rules in a little bit more detail. So first one is you got to aim for 10x outcomes. A little bit better than yesterday is not good enough. You actually have to have a vision of what it means to disrupt your industry, what it means to deliver 10x better experience, or run 10x faster in your operation, or deliver a project at 10x less cost or better economics. In Mary Barra's case, when she took over for GM in 2014, she basically said there's 3 trends that are going to reshape automotive and transportation: autonomy, electrification, and sharing. And she said, we have an opportunity to disrupt our industry, the car industry, if we invest in all 3 of those. And the 10X vision was to create a new type of transportation. That then fueled a bunch of steps, because she said, well, we don't have a lot of these pieces, right? We don't participate in the broader transportation piece or sharing piece, so they invested in Lyft, bought 10% of Lyft for $500 million, actually a good investment, because when it IPOs, it's probably gonna be worth 6. They also launched Maven, which is now in 40 cities. It's actually, think of it, Zipcar for gig workers, right? So anybody can get a car by the hour and actually, use it and return it, and it's fully insured, maintenance, serviced, all those things. They also bought a company called Cruise, 40-employee company, for $1 billion. That was an autonomy AI company out in California, because they knew that was a gap. And then lastly, I think this is where oftentimes as big companies, we're quick to write off our failures and run from them. Everybody scurries. Oh, that project, that was a disaster. GM didn't do that. And neither did Apple, right? In 1993, people forget about the Apple Newton, right? The Newton was a disaster, epic failure. But what happened in 2007, years later, they launched the iPhone, the most successful project ever. All the learning that came from the Newton, that failure went into that. GM did the same thing. What did they do in 1996? In 1996, they had a product called the EV1. Anybody remember that? First mass market electric car. Epic failure. But all the learning they got from that as a company to build a mass market electric car, what it takes, what kind of infrastructure you need in place, went into the Volt in 2010, and then the Bolt, which became Motor Trend Car of the Year in 2016, a year before Tesla got to market. So you can do it. Even companies that were almost bankrupt, like GM, can turn the corner and start to run at 2 speeds. And yes, they're getting criticized for closing plants, but these are exactly the kind of courageous things you need to do if you're going to create that path and second speed to 10x outcomes. Second thing is, you got to bring everybody along, and you got to empower your employees to innovate, but you also got to create protection for those really big swings. Because what happens is those big swings, like Maven or investing in Lyft, maybe create discomfort, because what if the person on the auto line saying, well, geez, you're probably going to need less cars if you build really efficient ride sharing. That's probably going to hurt our core business, right? So the way you bring things along is you run at 2 speeds in your innovation model. You empower your employees to innovate around today's business, and you give them the lowest friction path to do that. You give them time, resources, and energy. Most companies aren't good at that. They don't even have a process for what we call little I innovation. And then you create pathways and space for big I. The ability to provide air cover or oxygen for those things that need to be protected from the business, because otherwise we'll get crushed. Because the current business unit leaders will say, that's a distraction, or you're taking my talent, or you're siphoning off resources I need today to run. And this is where the courage piece comes in. MasterCard's a great example in the book. They basically run a program called Take Initiative. They run a 48-hour hackathon twice a year for their employees globally. You can imagine what that's like. I mean, MasterCard's in 200 countries, right? So they give people the time. Out of that hackathon, the top opportunities go into a program called Idea Box. First stage in Idea Box is you get a prepaid credit card, modest amount, and 60 days to formulate your concept with a team or whatever you want to do. If you get selected through that, that's called the orange box, you go to red box. You get 90 days and a bigger prepaid credit card that's like $10,000 to go build a prototype. If you get through that, you present to Ajay Banga, the CEO of MasterCard. If he and the investment committee approves your idea, you go to green box and you become a mini startup within MasterCard Labs, and you get 6 months out of your job to go pursue that. That's commitment to innovation. And what's cool is MasterCard recognizes there's two objectives there. Yeah, one, we might get some really cool ideas, and they've done that. They've hatched some peer-to-peer payment things and healthcare innovations out of that. But now they're training a whole army of entrepreneurs that are going to go back into their business that understand how to build ventures and how to innovate with new technologies like digital. So even if the people don't make it through, they've now had this experience that they become the evangelists and infectious. And they even have innovation scouts at the edge of their business that are looking for the next big idea. Weather Channel's a fun one. They used to be my client at Ubiquity, and what's cool is how many people know Jim Cantori, right? And I know you guys probably, especially given what you've been through in Houston, which is amazing when I look around the town at how much the bounce back is. It's awesome. In 2013, Weather Channel was pretty much a media company. That's how they made their money. Advertising, they had TV channels, they had a web property. They realized that weather is so fundamental to how companies run their business, right? Whether it's the apparel you put out, whether it's, if you're a food takeout business, people order more on a rainy day, how do you predict demand? They wanted to become a weather insights business to drive decisions for companies. That was a huge pivot, and David Kinney, the CEO, and Bryson Kohler, the CTO, basically said, we have to retool the mindset of the company. And what they did was they became a data company. They consolidated their data platforms. They became an API economy. They now have 25,000 companies that use the Weather Channel API. They hit it 26 billion times a day. They make money on those transactions, but more importantly, they deliver value back to those clients, whether it's an airline or a retailer, and they're changing their business. They also cut a deal with Apple where they get the data from every Apple Watch, the barometric sensor from a couple 100 million Apple Watches around the world. They can fill in their microclimate data. Pretty cool, right? And that's because now they value data as a company. And if I asked you guys, how many of you guys value data more than you value capital in your business today? Like when you go cut the next agreement with a supplier, do you basically cut an agreement for the data ownership? You know, is that part of the way you think? And this is, once again, the way a company's going to win in the future. This one's close to home in many ways, NASA, and actually the guy who drove this is from Houston. A guy named Jeff Davis was the chief medical officer at NASA. He's a brilliant guy if you ever want to talk to him about open innovation. This was back in 2005. NASA got their budget cut in half. These were tough times, and they basically had no choice but to figure out how to operate differently. They couldn't go to the Lockheeds and Boeings of the world and pay them to do R&D or pay their internal scientists. They flipped their model completely. They basically said, we need to get more than half of our innovations from outside of NASA, for brand new sources, startups, venture capitalists, new types of companies we haven't dealt with before, like the SpaceX's of the world. This was a journey, and it was a huge cultural shift from a culture that rewarded invention to one that actually rewarded solution finding. Very different, right? When the incentives are all stacked to get patents and push products out of your engineering group, instead saying, you know what, if you find the next cool innovation on the outside and we're able to scale that, we're going to incent and reward that and celebrate. That shift, including putting the tools, infrastructure, incentives in place, made NASA a poster child in the rest of the US government. In fact, NASA got asked to set up a center of excellence around collaborative innovation and open innovation for all the other agencies. So, great story. One of my favorite ones that came out of this is open innovation, of course, is about putting your problems out to the world. NASA put a problem out with a very modest prize, $10,000, to say, could you predict a solar flare better than our scientists? And if you know anything about solar flares, they wreak havoc on spacecraft because they're loaded with radiation. If you can predict them, you can kind of avert the effects. So NASA scientists hadn't done any better than a day ahead and 50% accuracy. They put this out with a $10,000 prize, and some retired radio engineer solved it with 85% accuracy with an 8-hour look ahead. And this is something their scientists have wrestled with for decades, right? And that just shows you the power of tapping into the world for innovation. Sometimes it's just about realizing you may not be the smartest people in the world, you know, that there's other people outside